My name is Mateo Jarquin. I'm originally from Nicaragua. I also do my research here at Harvard in the history department on Nicaragua. And so, based on the big human rights crisis that started unfolding in Nicaragua last year, I wanted to do a piece trying to explain why that happened and how that crisis is going to unfold. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in December released a report in which it accused the government of President Daniel Ortega of crimes against humanity. So really, this is one of the worst human rights crises that we've seen in Latin America since the end of the Cold War, when most of the region's countries transitioned to democracy. Now, the reason why this crisis exploded last year is a little complex, and the article goes into it. But basically, what you can say is that over the past 10 years, you had multilateral lending institutions like the World Bank, or travel journalists like HuffPost Travel. They would look at Nicaragua, which was governed by Daniel Ortega under a sort of soft authoritarian regime, and they would say, this is the next big development success story. This is the next Costa Rica. But some of us who are more critical and looking at the political space would say, okay, well, on the surface, it looks good. You have economic growth. But what we would say is that when you close off all political spaces, you're harassing journalists, you're rigging elections, that can help create stability in the short run. But in the long run, that's going to create instability because eventually, for one reason or another, people are going to hit the streets, and this sort of authoritarian government is programmed to repress. And so in Nicaragua, it happened to be that the spark which lit the prairie fire was these pension reforms, which were particularly hard on the elderly. But really, when young university students came out to protest, and the government met these protests with violence, what happened was that Nicaraguans realized that their right to protest had been criminalized. And that plunged the country into a spiral of protest, repression, more protest, until basically the government imposed a state of terror. It started in April 2018. Right now we're in 2019, which actually marks the 40th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, which in 1979 overthrew the US-backed Somoza dictatorship and then quickly entered into confrontation with US-backed insurgents known as the Contra. A lot of people are going to be talking about, well, what's the balance sheet? What's the legacy? And clearly this, really tremendous violence and instability that we've seen in Nicaragua at the hands of somebody who actually overthrew a previous dictator, Daniel Ortega, that's going to really fuel this debate even further. Really, the government has consolidated itself and has opted for a strategy of just repression, willing to incur very high costs, both for itself diplomatically, but also for the Nicaraguan people, in a bid to just stay in power. So in that context, it's sort of difficult to imagine what can change in order for the government to feel compelled to come negotiate elections when it has the police, the paramilitary forces, and the army on its side. So they were running out of money. They decided to do a pension reform, which would have asked workers to contribute more of their salary, but also employers to contribute more money to the Social Security fund. It's essentially a reduction in pension disbursements, a tax on both workers and employers. And this obviously directly hurts old people, right? But it was the young that came out onto the streets. And that raises some interesting questions. On the one hand, in countries like those of Latin America, where the social safety net is very weak, and then the state decides to sort of pull back its responsibility to care for citizens such as those older than 60, 65, then it falls on actual citizens to fill that role. So, if you're young, that means you have to take more care of your parents when you're older. But also in an authoritarian country, these sorts of policy changes, which affect one group disproportionately, can be mediated by other people's concerns about what's going on in the country. So, for example, let's say you're a farmer, right? And you have to rely on the government for agricultural subsidies. And in order to get those subsidies, you have to at least show that you're in line with the party, right? You might ask, well, I've been doing that for 10 years because, I was getting the access to state services that I needed. But is it really worth it if they're not going to take care of our elderly? Or let's say, you're fed up with the corruption in Nicaragua and you say, of course, they can't now pay out these pension payments because they squandered that money on corruption or to buy off political allies. And so, in sum, this sort of crisis of policy towards the elderly symbolized for a lot of Nicaraguans all the different ways in which the government had closed political spaces, in which the party and the state had become one thing, and in which Nicaraguans were seeing their fundamental rights, whether it's economic rights such as the pension or access to education, or political rights such as freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. This crisis of the elderly and pensions symbolized to Nicaraguans that this was an unsustainable situation and that they needed to fight back for those fundamental rights.